Hey friends, I'm the storyteller. Before you get too comfortable, do me a small favor, hit like and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy this kind of storytelling. And while you're here, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always love seeing how far these stories reach. Damilola Taylor was born on the 7th of December, 1989 in Lagos, Nigeria, to parents Richard and Gloria Taylor. He was the youngest of 3 children. His older sister Bemi and his older brother Tunde were both nearly a decade older than him. In many ways, Damilola was the miracle child his mother had longed for another baby, especially a son, but it just hadn't happened, not until Damilola. So he was the baby of the family. When he was still learning to read and ride his bike, his siblings were already off to university. But that age gap didn't make him feel left out, if anything. It made him stand out more. He had this light in him, that kind of bright, contagious energy that you don't see in everyone. He smiled a lot, he performed a lot, he was a natural entertainer, outgoing, confident, full of spirit, the kind of kid who walks into a room and lights it up without even trying. His dad once described him as an old soul. You know the kind, those children who seem like they've lived before? Who can sit down with adults and talk like they've got decades of wisdom tucked behind their smile? That was Damilola. He could carry a full conversation with anyone, no matter how old they were. And he had this habit of making everyone feel heard, seen like they mattered. In those early years, the Taylors lived in the city of Ketu in Lagos. Damilola attended the Wisdom Montessori school in a nearby town called Ijora. Life in Nigeria was good. Richard, the father, worked as a civil servanta, stable and well-paying job. The children went to good schools. They had a home, a routine, and a sense of place. But everything started to change in the year 2000. That was when Bemi Damilola's sister began to suffer more seriously from epilepsy. She had been dealing with the condition for a while, but suddenly it got worse. Much worse. Her seizures became more frequent, more intense, and more dangerous. The family reached a point where they knew that if they didn't find better treatment, real life-saving treatment, they could lose her. And so, the Taylors made a decision that would change everything. The treatment that Beme needed wasn't something that could be easily accessed in Nigeria. Either it simply wasn't available at all, or it was far too expensive for the average family to afford. The exact situation isn't completely clear, but what made a difference in Bem's case was the fact that she had actually been born in the UK. Back when Richard and Gloria Taylor first got married and began raising their family, they spent some time living in London. That's where their 2 eldest children, Beam and Tunde, were born. And because of that, Beam held British citizenship. That meant she qualified for free medical care under the NHS, including the specialist treatment she so desperately needed for her worsening epilepsy. So, with that in mind, the Taylors made a huge decision, a heartbreaking one, but necessary. They decided to split the family. Richard, the father, couldn't leave Nigeria. His job was crucial, not only to his career, but to keeping the family afloat financially. It was a role he couldn't just walk away from. But Beam's condition was deteriorating quickly. Time wasn't on their side, and they couldn't afford to wait until a more convenient moment. So Gloria Taylor made the decision to take Beam and Tunde to London without her husband. That was the original plan, just the 3 of them. But Damilola didn't want to be left behind. At that point, he was just 10 years old. He had started school in Nigeria, he was building a life, he was happy, he had friends, he was doing well. Richard understandably didn't want to disrupt that. He didn't want to uproot his son from a stable environment and drop him into a new country, a new culture, a new school system. But Damilola was insistent. He pleaded with his father over and over again. He didn't want to stay behind. He didn't want to be apart from his mother, his brother, his sister. He wanted to be with them. Finally, after a lot of back and forth, Richard gave in. So, in the year 2000, Gloria left Nigeria with all 3 children, Beam, Tunde, and Damilola. They moved to London. They stayed with a family member who lived on the North Peckham estate in South London. It wasn't glamorous. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Peckham was, and in some areas still is, a place marked by poverty, high unemployment, and high crime rates. It was a tough area, and in the early 2000s, it was even worse than it is today. But the Taylors didn't have much choice. They were a single income household, technically a one-parent setup now that Richard remained in Nigeria. Gloria couldn't work. She had to focus entirely on Beam's care. The only money they had was what Richard sent from overseas. Tunde took on a part-time job to help, but there was no luxury in their living arrangement. A flat was all they could manage, and they were just trying to survive. They'd moved for health, for safety, for a better chance at life, but they stepped into a completely different world they weren't prepared for. The pace, the pressure, the undercurrent of danger that came with living in that environment. It was nothing like the life they had known in Nigeria. In Lagos, they had comfort, routine, a good income, stability. This new world was cold, unforgiving, and unpredictable. This was a total shock for them. So anyway, the family settled into the flat they were staying in for now. It was home, it wasn't spacious. All four of them were crammed into a small space. And most nights, they were sleeping in the living room. Some on the sofa, others on the floor. It wasn't comfortable, but it was necessary. It was what they had. Tunde was juggling a lot. He was a university student, but also stepped up to get a part-time job to help support the household. Beme started her treatment straight away. It was intense, but it was working. And Damilolahe started school. He was settling in quickly. Even in this unfamiliar place, even with the cold and the culture shock, Damilola adapted. He made friends. He found his rhythm. He played football with the other boys at break time and quickly earned a spot as their favorite goalkeeper. He was good, so good that the other boys always wanted him on their team, every time. He wasn't just into playing football either, he loved watching it too. He supported Manchester United. And sometimes Liverpool, depending on who was winning, he could talk football all day. Within just a few weeks of arriving in the UK, Damilola had already saved up enough pocket money to buy his first pair of football boots. He was proud of them, and he was proud of himself. But it wasn't just about football. Damilola genuinely loved school. He loved the structure, the routine, the energy of it. He loved learning. He loved his teachers. He loved his friends. One of the things that amazed him most was the technology UK schools had laptops, computer rooms, all kinds of equipment that his school back in Nigeria just didn't have. That difference lit something up in him. He called his dad on the phone, excited, buzzing with stories. He told him that he was on track to become a prefect. He said the teachers had noticed how responsible he was, that he was trying hard, that he wanted to lead. But most importantly, he told his dad he didn't want to come back. The original plan was for Damilola to spend 3 months in London and then return to Nigeria to finish school. That was the deal. Richard had made it clear this was temporary, but Damilola had changed his mind. He loved it too much. He loved the people, the pace, the energy of it all. He begged his dad not to send him back because he wanted to stay. He loved his UK school. He loved his friends. Damilola was deeply invested in his future. Even at just 10 years old, he was already thinking ahead about his life, his education, his career. He didn't see school as just something he had to do. He saw it as an opportunity, a stepping stone to something bigger. And he took it seriously. He would come home from school and go straight to his homework. No distractions, no need to be told. And when he was done with that, he'd often head out again, this time to the local library, just to keep learning, just to do more. That's the kind of child he was. He wanted to give himself the best possible chance in life. Naturally, his parents were thrilled. Gloria was proud. Richard, even from afar, was proud. It was every parent's dream to have a child who loved learning, who pushed himself without being pushed. Damilola had that spark, that focus, that vision. But not everyone saw that as something to admire. In fact, for some, it made him a target. To certain kids in the area, especially the older ones, Damilola's behavior was seen as geeky, like he was trying too hard, like he was sucking up to the teachers. And in some of the rougher areas of London, especially around estates like North Peckham, that kind of attitude could attract the wrong kind of attention. The trouble began in November of 2000. By then, Damilola had been living in London for just over 2 months. And around that time, he began going to the Peckham Library after school. He'd walk there most days, spend time reading, doing homework, sometimes just using the computers. And then, after that, he'd walk home alone. It was winter. The days were short. The streets were dark. He was just a 10-year-old boy, a quiet boy, still fairly new to the country, still learning how things worked, still adjusting. And on those walks home from the library, older kids started to notice him. They would hang around the streets, watching, waiting. These weren't his classmates. They were teenagers' boys from a different school, older, louder, harsher. It started off as verbal abuse. At first, it was just taunts, insults, shouts across the road. But it grew quickly. There wasn't one specific group. It was a rotating cast of older boys who hung out near the library or the bus stops nearby. Most of them were from a different primary school in the area. In fact, the local kids often described the two schools as rivals. The school that Damilolo went to was predominantly made up of ethnic minority students. The other one was mostly white. And some of the older kids from that other school had made it a routine waiting outside for the younger ones from Damilola's school and targeting them as they walked home. For Damilola, it started with racial slurs. They mocked his Nigerian accent, called him names. Some of the insults were homophobic, calling him gay, or other words he likely didn't even fully understand at his age. But he never fought back, never shouted. He just kept his head down and walked. He was shy, he was quiet, he didn't want trouble. But that didn't matter. These boys weren't looking for a fight. They were looking for a victim. And that's what Damilola became. The bullying wasn't just about words. It was intimidation, threats, sometimes physical, and eventually it turned into theft, mugging. They would wait for kids like him to come out of school or out of the library and surround them. It wasn't even about money. Kids that age barely had anything on them. Sometimes a few coins to buy a snack on the way home, but even that was enough. They would steal phones if the kids had them, though back in the year 2000, most 10-year-olds didn't. So instead, they stole what they could. They would steal Pokemon cards, quartz, anything. On the 26th of November, 2000, Damilola came home and told his mother, Gloria, something that no parent ever wants to hear. He told her that he had been getting harassed, abused by older boys on his way home from the library, that it was happening every single day. Verbal abuse, intimidation, fear. And this wasn't just playground teasing. It was something deeper, something darker. Naturally, Gloria was deeply concerned. She asked him who the boys were. She wanted names. What school did they go to? Where did they hang out? She was ready to find them and confront them herself. She was a mother trying to protect her child. But Damilola wouldn't tell her. He refused. He was afraid that if she got involved, it would only make things worse, that they'd find out and come after him harder. So all Gloria could do was try to find a way to protect him quietly without making it worse. The next morning, the 27th of November, she decided to walk him to school herself. Normally, that job had fallen to Tunde. But with his university schedule and part-time job, he couldn't always be there. So Gloria took Damilola. She promised him she wouldn't say anything. But after she dropped him off at the gates, she went into the school anyway. She pulled the head teacher aside and explained what was happening, asked them to keep an eye on him. But what Gloria didn't know was that the abuse wasn't happening inside school grounds. It was happening on the streets, outside the safety of the gates. That same day, Damilola had a normal day at school. He was in good spirits. After school, he walked to Peckham Library just like he always did. He spent some time there reading, maybe doing homework, and around 4:50 p.m., he left to walk home. There's CCTV footage from that day of Damilola leaving the library. He's jumping on benches, laughing, playing. He looks carefree, happy. But within an hour of those clips being recorded, Damilola Taylor would be dead. When he didn't arrive home at the usual time, Gloria began to panic. After what he told her the night before, her mind jumped straight to the worst. What if those boys had done something? What if they'd taken it further? She went out into the night to look for him, walking the streets, retracing his route, asking people along the way, his teachers, staff at the library, neighbors if they'd seen him, but no one had. No one had seen Damilola. She was almost home nearing the end of the route when she saw flashing lights on Blake's Road, police cars, ambulances, a crime scene. She ran toward it, heart pounding, and spoke to the officer standing by the tape. They told her that a young boy had been attacked, and Gloria just knew. It had to be him. It had to be Damilola. What we know next is what police were able to piece together after the fact. They believe Damilola left the library and made it most of the way home. He got within just 400 yards of the housing estate. That's when he was stopped. A group of older boys surrounded him, shouting the usual insults, mocking, trying to intimidate him. Police believe they were attempting to mug him. They wanted something from him. But Damilola didn't have anything. Or maybe he just refused to hand anything over. Police suspect they were trying to steal his silver puffer coat. A bright, shiny jacket his mother had just bought him because the winter weather was setting in. That coat made him stand out. And when he didn't give it up, the boys turned violent. We don't know exactly what happened next. We don't know what they said, what they did, what Damilola felt in those terrifying minutes, but we do know how it ended. One of the boys picked up a broken bottle from the ground and stabbed Damilola in the leg with it. The injury was catastrophic. The broken glass tore into his femoral artery, and the attacker twisted intentionally before fleeing. The wound was shaped like an S, 6 centimeters long, deep, and vicious. He was losing blood quickly. It wasn't enough to make him collapse instantly. He could still move. Barely, he staggered. And somehow, despite the pain, despite the panic, Damilola found the strength to get up. He didn't just lay there. He didn't give up. He got up and began staggering over to the nearest estate that he could to try to make his way home. He managed to pull himself to the opening of an outdoor stairwell. It wasn't even close to his own estate. He'd wandered further than he probably realized, desperately trying to get home. The bleeding was severe, and every step took everything he had left. But Damilola didn't stop. He was just 10 years old, bleeding from a wound that would have dropped most adults. But he was still trying, still moving. He began climbing the stairs. It was a long stairwell, concrete, cold, unwelcoming. With every step upward, he grew weaker, more lightheaded. The blood loss was catching up to him. He must have been in unbearable pain, but he kept going, one foot in front of the other, until finally, near the top of the stairwell, his body couldn't take it anymore. He collapsed. At the same time, a man who lived in the estate was walking home. He passed the base of the stairwell and something stopped him in his tracks, a trail of blood. It wasn't subtle. There weren't a few drops here and there. It was heavy, thick, consistent. He knew immediately that whoever left that trail needed help, urgently. So he followed it step by step, up the concrete stairs until he found Damilola, who collapsed on the landing. He was barely conscious, his small body slumped over, fading. The man rushed to him, dropped to the ground, and cradled him in his arms. He looked him over, trying to find where the blood was coming from. And that's when Damilola looked up at him. Just for a moment, just long enough to try to smile. And then he said in barely a whisper the last words he would ever speak, "I'm okay." The man immediately called emergency services. He was panicking, desperate. He told them, "There's a boy bleeding to death." He's actually bleeding to death. This boy is approximately 12 years of age. He's lost a hell of a lot of blood. As he spoke to the operator, Damilola's condition worsened. He was drifting in and out of consciousness. The man knew he didn't have much time left. He told the emergency operator, "He's going." By this time, more people had arrived at the stairwell. The man had shouted for help, and others from the surrounding flats had come running. Now there were about 5 people gathered around Damilola. They tried to help treat, to stop the bleeding, to slow it, to do something. But the wound was too severe. The blood loss was too great. When paramedics finally arrived, they did everything they could. They worked on him right there in that stairwell, but his leg had stopped bleeding. And that, tragically, meant his heart had stopped pumping. There was nothing left to circulate. His body had already begun to shut down. Damilola Taylor was officially pronounced dead at the hospital shortly after 5:30 p.m., but in truth, police believe he died there, in that stairwell, before help could reach him. And all of this was going on just 10 days before his 11th birthday. In the midst of all the pain, his family later said that there was one small comfort tone silver lining, if you can even call it that. It was knowing that Damilola hadn't died alone. Even though he was surrounded by strangers in his final moments, those strangers had stayed with him. They had tried to comfort him. They said they were his friends in those final minutes, and that meant something to the Taylors. Meanwhile, Back at the hospital, the family waited in the quiet agony of the waiting room. Gloria, Tunda, and Bemi hoping for news, dreading what that news might be. Tunda knew what had to be done. He had to call his father, Richard Taylor, back in Nigeria. He walked over to a payphone and placed the call. At the time, Richard was in the middle of a meeting, an important one. But the call didn't go to his personal office. It came through to the head office, which immediately struck him as strange. Why would his family be calling there? They told him it was urgent. Richard stepped out of the meeting, confused and slightly anxious, and then he was told the truth. His 10-year-old son had been murdered. He said the moment he heard those words, "Damilola is gone," everything became a blur, his body gave out, he collapsed. When he woke up, he was in the medical center, being treated for shock. As soon as he was physically able, he booked the earliest flight he could and made his way to London. But his grief wasn't private. From the moment he stepped off the plane, Richard was followed by reporters, by photographers, by the eyes of the press, flashbulbs, microphones, headlines. He had just lost his son in the most brutal, senseless way imaginable, and the media wouldn't even give him the space to breathe. Of course, there was sympathy. People across the country felt for the Taylors. This was every parent's nightmare. A 10-year-old boy just walking home, doing everything right, and this still happened. It struck a nerve. A lot of people had been bullied as children. A lot of parents had worried about the same thing happening to their own kids. It felt personal. And for many, it wasn't just that a child had died. It was the way he died, the way he tried to smile, the way he told that man, "I'm okay," the way he fought to live, all the way until the end. A lot of journalists and news presenters said it felt like the country had lost a child. Not just a name in a headline, but someone they knew. Someone they could see in their own sons, nephews, or brothers. And, as expected, the media covered the case nonstop. It was one of the biggest stories in the country, a child murdered on the streets of London and left to die in a stairwell. There was no way the press were going to ignore that. But in typical UK media fashion, they didn't handle it with care. There was no respect, no restraint. They followed the family, showed up outside their home, tried to shove cameras into their faces during their grief. And Richard Taylor, he just couldn't take it. He wanted to be there. He wanted to stay in the UK to support his wife, his daughter, and to fight for justice for his son. But the pressure was too much. The constant attention, the invasion of privacy became unbearable. So, in the end, he made the heartbreaking decision to go back to Nigeria. But before he left, the police gave him a promise. They told him they were going to do everything in their power to find out who did this to Damilola, that they weren't going to stop until they had justice. Over 60 officers were assigned to the investigation, which is one of the biggest police murder investigations that they'd had in years. The investigation began with what the police did have: CCTV footage. They traced Damilola's final steps as best they could, starting with the library. There, he was clear as day on camera. Inside the building, riding the lift, smiling. Everything looked perfectly normal. He wasn't in distress. He wasn't being followed. He was just a 10-year-old boy enjoying the afternoon. After he left the library, more footage captured him playing outside. He wasn't alone. He was with two familiar faces, friend John and John's older sister Grace. The three of them were playing tag on the pavement, laughing, chasing each other. It was ordinary. It was sweet. And it was the last time anyone would see Damilola Taylor alive. Interestingly, that friend Jonas, now known to most of the world as John Boyega, the actor from the Star Wars films. But back then, he was just a regular kid. He and Damilola had gone to the same school, and John had actually helped Damilola settle into London life. He was one of his closest friends when he first arrived. And Grace, John's sister, remembered that afternoon well. They'd all been smiling. Nothing seemed wrong. After playing for a while, they said goodbye. John and Grace walked off one way, and Damilola headed in the other toward home. Unfortunately, that was where the CCTV trail ended. There weren't cameras covering every part of his route, so police lost sight of him partway through his walk. What they could see, what they did manage to gather from scattered bits of surveillance, was that Damilola wasn't being followed. No one appeared to be stalking him. No shadowy figures. No one looked suspicious. On camera, at least, it seemed like everything was fine, but of course it wasn't. And so, with limited footage and no immediate suspects, the investigation had to shift to manual police work. Officers hit the streets. They scoured the area where Damalola was found, combing the stairwell and surrounding estates. They were looking for any evidence, clues, something that might have been left behind or discarded. They were hoping to get lucky, and they did. On the ground, not far from where Damalola had collapsed, they found shards of broken glass bottle fragments. And some of those fragments had traces of blood on them. It was a match. It was Damalola's blood. That broken bottle had been the weapon used to stab him. It wasn't much, but it was something. The glass was carefully collected and sent off for testing. At the time, DNA technology wasn't as advanced as it is today. It was still in development. But the police ran what they had through the system, hoping for a hit. Nothing came back. But that wasn't entirely unexpected. Because if Damalola had been killed by another Childor, a group of teenagers, as they were beginning to suspect then, it made sense that their DNA wouldn't be in any criminal database yet. Most children had no criminal history, no entries, no prior arrests. The system wouldn't recognize them. Still, they held onto that broken glass. Because it wasn't just a clue, it was the murder weapon. And if they ever got a suspect, even months or years later, they could run the comparison. They could then test the suspect against the murder weapon. Police took to the streets. They started going door to door across the estate, knocking on doors, speaking with residents, asking the same questions over and over again. Had anyone seen anything that night? Heard anything? Did anyone stand out? Did they know of someone who might be capable of doing this? Someone who had a history of violence? Essentially, they were asking people to turn someone in, to dob someone in. But that kind of approach wasn't going to work, not in Peckham, not in 2000. The truth was, the relationship between the police and the local community, particularly minority communities, was tense. Very tense. Most people weren't willing to cooperate. They didn't want to help. And not because they didn't care, but because they didn't trust the system asking for their help. It's important to remember that this was happening just a year after the public inquiry into the murder of Stephen Lawrencia, black teenager who had also been stabbed and killed in a racially motivated attack in London. That case had exposed deep-rooted issues within the police issues of negligence, failure, and racism. The Lawrence case had already shaken public trust. Many in the black community felt that police didn't care about them, that they weren't protected, that they weren't heard. They believed the system was institutionally racist, and in many cases, they had good reason to think so. So when officers started knocking on doors, asking questions, hoping for information, most people just shut those doors right back in their faces. Some refused to even answer. It wasn't just about distrust. It was fear. It was frustration. It was self-preservation. In areas like Peckham, where crime rates were already high, opening your door to a police officer felt like inviting trouble. Because if you'd committed crimes before, and many in the area had, you didn't want police knowing your face, knowing your name. You didn't want to sit down and chat. Even if you had nothing to do with Damalola's murder, the idea of being near the police was enough to make people uneasy. And then there was another layer to it. People were scared. There were whispers, what if this was gang-related? What if it was random? A 10-year-old boy stabbed in broad daylight for no personal reason at all. That terrified people. Because if that could happen to Damalola, it could happen to anyone. And if someone said the wrong thing, if they told police something they weren't supposed to, what if they were next? People feared retaliation, or they felt loyalty to someone they suspected, or maybe they just didn't want to get involved. Either way, the streets stayed quiet, and so the police leaned into that silence. They knew people were staying quiet either out of fear or out of loyalty. They didn't want to rob their friend. And so the police really played on that. In a bid to get people, particularly young people, to speak up, the police tried a different approach. They realized that traditional door-to-door inquiries weren't working. The silence was deafening. So they decided to turn to people these youths might actually listen to. People they admired, respected, looked up to. Police reached out to celebrities, footballers, actors, musicians, anyone they thought could hold some kind of influence in these communities. And those figures stepped up. They recorded public appeals. Messages aired on television and radio, posted on walls and screens across the city, each one pleading, if you know anything about the murder of Damalola Taylor, please come forward. These weren't cold or robotic police statements. These were emotional, personal appeals. The kind of messages meant to speak directly to the hearts of those who might be holding on to the truth. To add to that, a reward was offered £50,000. It was a massive amount at the time, and it was meant to encourage those who might be hesitant. Money talks, and maybe, just maybe, it would convince someone to finally speak out. Meanwhile, police knew they had another urgent problem: security. Whoever had done this to Damalola was still out there, still free. And if they could do this to an innocent 10-year-old child, they could do it again. So police presence in Peckham was increased dramatically. Officers were stationed at nearly every estate. They were walking patrols, keeping an eye on the streets, monitoring activity. It was both for protection and for visibility. The public needed to feel safe, or at least that was the intention. But in reality, it backfired. The constant police presence only worsened tensions between the community and law enforcement. People in Peckham would leave their flats and immediately see uniformed officers. Every day, every corner, it began to feel like surveillance, like they were being watched, like they were being targeted. To many residents, it felt less like protection and more like control. And it didn't help that people were already frustrated, already feeling like the police never listened until it was too late. Some residents even argued that those resources would have been better used elsewhere, instead of having officers just loitering around estate car parks. Still, the investigation pressed on. And around this time, the police made an announcement. They were looking to speak with 3 black youths who had reportedly been seen near the stairwell around the time Damalola was murdered. Witnesses described them as boys aged between 11 and 15, all wearing large, dark hooded sweatshirts. One report even stated that they'd been spotted running away from the scene shortly after the estimated time of the attack. Some sources went even further. They claimed that the man who found Damalola, who called the emergency services, had looked out of the window near the stairwell and spotted the 3 boys outside, and that one of them had made a stabbing motion on his thigh, almost like a reenactment of what had just happened. Now, I don't know how true that is. It's unclear whether there were even any windows near the location where Damalola was found. The architecture of that stairwell didn't really lend itself to a clear view, so maybe that part was a rumor. Maybe it was speculation, but I thought it was interesting to add anyway. In the weeks that followed, the investigation turned frantic. Police arrested and released a total of 11 different people. 11 individuals they considered persons of interest, possible suspects, potential witnesses, maybe even accomplices. They were doing everything in their power to find the right person, to build a case that could actually hold up in court, but it wasn't easy. What they needed, what they didn't have, was solid evidence. And without that, each arrest was temporary. Each suspect was let go. The police couldn't hold them without a charge, and a charge without evidence wouldn't stick. So it became a revolving door arrest, question, release. Most of these individuals were teenage boys from the Peckham area. Some of them had been seen in the area on the night of Damalola's murder. Others simply fit a loose description. One of the boys reportedly became violent when arrested, headbutting officers and shouting at them, "What are you going to do about that?" Even one of the boys' mothers was arrested just in case she'd been involved. But in the end, every one of them walked free. That didn't mean they were in the clear. Not completely. Police still had their eyes on many of them. But without hard evidence, there was nothing more they could do. At least for the time being. Then, finally, a breakthrough. In the spring of 2001, about 4 or 5 months after Damalola's death, a 14-year-old girl came forward. She told police that she had witnessed the murder. She said she'd been too scared to speak up until now, but she had seen it happen. According to her, the attack was carried out by 4 boys. She personally knew 3 of them, the older ones, and she recognized the youngest, though she had never spoken to him directly. And just like that, the police had 4 names. Based on her statement, 4 boys-ish between 11 and 16 were arrested and charged with the murder of Damalola Taylor. On the 30th of January, 2002, the trial began. But from the very beginning, something felt off. The boys didn't seem to grasp the gravity of what was happening. One was yawning through most of the proceedings. Another brought along a puzzle book like a child's coloring book to keep himself entertained during court. That's how young he was. Their behavior was described as casual, detached, as if they were on a school trip, not standing trial for murder. And unfortunately for investigators, the case wasn't as strong as they'd hoped. The cornerstone of their prosecution was the testimony of a 14-year-old girl. But eyewitness evidence is always risky. Human memory is fragile. It doesn't record like a video camera. It edits, it fills in blanks, it adapts over time, and in this case, a lot of time had passed. Damilola had been murdered at the end of 2000. This trial was happening in early 2002. That's over a year for memories to fade, shift, or reshape themselves. Even if she was being on a stand, maybe there was still the question. Was her memory accurate? Was it reliable enough to convict someone of murder? And then came the defense's argument. They pointed out that the girl came from a struggling background, a poor family. They suggested that maybe she was motivated not by justice, but by money. Specifically, the £50,000 reward that had been publicly offered. They argued that she might have seen this as an opportunity. Since she'd come forward, the police had bought her clothes because she didn't have many. They gave her a mobile phone so they could stay in contact. They were supporting her, looking after her. And yes, while she wouldn't be eligible for the full reward until she turned 18, she was still receiving some kind of benefit for her involvement. She was seeing some kind of reward for this. So the defense pushed the idea of inducement. They argued that the girl who testified wasn't telling the truth, not because she was mistaken, but because she was motivated by money. Whether she realized it or not, she had been influenced, bribed, manipulated. According to the defense, she didn't come forward to seek justice for Damilola Taylor. She came forward for the reward. And on top of that, she wasn't proving to be a very reliable witness. She had changed her story more than once. Small inconsistencies at first, but then bigger ones. She even admitted to police that she lied. Originally, she said that she saw the boys walking with Damilola, but that by the time she caught up with them, they had all scattered. Damilola had already gone up the stairs. She never actually saw the moment of the attack, but then police allegedly told her something that changed everything. They reportedly said that if she had witnessed the stab and jiv, she had seen one of the boys actually carry it out, she would be more likely to receive the reward money. And suddenly, her story changed. Now, she claimed that she had seen the stabbing. She even described the motion, the moment, but it was a contradiction. And that raised red flags. In court, things didn't get any better. She became combative, defensive. She shouted back at the defense attorneys, accusing them of talking down to her, treating her like a child. At one point, in a moment of raw frustration, she stood up and stormed out of the courtroom altogether. She did come back, calmly, quietly, but the damage was done. To the court, it revealed something deeper her lack of maturity, her emotional instability. It gave the impression that she wasn't there to help solve a murder. She was there for herself. In the end, the judge came to a final ruling. He declared her an unreliable witness. She had lied in court, she had altered her story, and based on that, all 4 boys were acquitted of the charges. They walked free. But the police and Damilola's family weren't done. Not even close. They were determined to continue. If those weren't the right boys, they would find who was. And if those boys were the right ones, they would dig until they found evidence that would actually stick. They weren't chasing names, they were chasing truth. And they knew they needed one thing: a golden piece of evidence. The case was then handed over to a new lead investigator, someone who came in with fresh eyes and a new mindset. His plan was simple: start everything from scratch, retest every piece of evidence, re-interview every witness, reanalyze every theory. Nothing was going to be left behind this time. And that's when the team found something. 3 boys, 3 leads that had once been on the radar but hadn't been investigated thoroughly enough. Names that had shown up during the original round of arrests then quietly disappeared when no evidence turned up. Now it was time to look again. The boys were older, now aged 16, 17, and 19. But back in 2000, when Damilola was murdered, they were just 12, 13, and 15 years old. And in 2005, those 3 boys were arrested again. As it turned out, they had actually been part of that original group, the 11 suspects arrested and released early in the case when there wasn't enough to go on. Now, 5 years later, they were back in custody. The 2 younger boys who had been 12 and 13 at the time were still underage in 2005, so their names were withheld from the media. But eventually, as they reached adulthood, those names came out. The younger one was Danny Preddy. The older his brother was Ricky Preddy. At the time of the murder, Danny was 12. Ricky was 13. The third suspect, older than both of them, was already 19 by 2005, so his name had been public from the start. He was Hassan Jihad, 15 at the time of the attack. Now, all three boys were in custody once again. And while the police rushed to lock down the scene, retrace every step, and reopen every folder, they were doing everything they could to gather that one thing they still needed most, that solid golden nugget piece of evidence against these boys. So, like I mentioned earlier, the new lead investigator had made it his mission to start from zero. That meant retesting every scrap of evidence they had, and now that they had three new suspects, they had something they didn't have before: comparison DNA. The first thing they did was re-examine the broken glass, the murder weapon. Along with that, they tested other items recovered from the scene. With modern DNA analysis more advanced than it had been 5 years earlier, they could finally run proper matches. And now they had 3 profiles to test against. But they didn't stop there. Investigators also searched through the boys' homes. They went into the bedrooms of Danny and Ricky Preddy and Hassan Jihad, combing through their wardrobes, shoes, and personal belongings looking for anything that matched the description of the 3 boys seen that night. Big, dark hoodies, heavy shoes, anything that could link them visually to the scene. And they found it. Items of clothing matching the witness descriptions were collected, bagged, and sent off for testing. Hoodies, trainers, sweatshirts, all of it. What came back changed the entire case. DNA tests revealed Damilola's blood on Danny Preddy's shoes. There was also blood on Ricky Preddy's sweatshirt. And even more than that, there was significant fiber transfer between Damilola's clothes and the clothing of all 3 suspects. Fibers from Damilola's silver coat were found on each of the boys' garments and vice versa. Their clothing fibers were also found on him. This meant physical contact. They had been close to him. They had touched him. There was no way to explain that kind of fiber and blood transfer unless they'd been in direct contact with Damilola while he was bleeding. It didn't matter who had held the broken bottle. It didn't matter who had made the stab. What mattered was that they were all there and they all had a part in what happened. And finally, after 5 long years of grief, frustration, and dead ends, police had what they needed: the blood, the fibers, the clothing, the DNA. It was enough. So they arrested all 3 boys, Danny Preddy, Ricky Preddy, and Hassan Jihad, in suspicion of Damilola Taylor's murder. They didn't know which one had delivered the fatal blow, but they were certain of one thing: they were all there, so they were all arrested. The trial was scheduled for 2006. All 3 boys, Danny and Ricky Preddy and Hassan Jihad, pleaded not guilty to the charges. But the tone of the courtroom was strange from the beginning. Ricky Preddy, the older of the 2 brothers, even brought a note with him that he read out in court. On it he had written, "Real justice for Damola Taylor." He spelled Damilola's name wrong. The defense teams knew what they were up against. At this point, it was clear that the boys were involved. The blood evidence, the fiber exchange, there was no denying that. The question now wasn't whether they were guilty of something, but whether they were guilty of murder. So the defense shifted their approach. They stopped trying to argue innocence and instead tried to reframe the story. They admitted the boys had been there, that they'd had some kind of altercation with Damilola. But they said it wasn't premeditated, it wasn't murder. According to them, the boys had pushed Damilola during a scuffle, and he'd fallen, landing directly onto a shard of broken glass that had been on the ground. That's how he'd been injured, they claimed. It wasn't a stabbing. It was a tragic accident. It was a bold argument, but legally speaking, a possible one. The forensic evidence couldn't definitively prove that any of the boys had picked up the bottle and used it as a weapon. And when a pathologist examined Damilola's wound, they confirmed that the injury could indeed have been caused by someone falling onto a shard of glass. So that introduced doubt. And in a courtroom, doubt is everything. Because of that uncertainty, the oldest of the 3 boys, Hassan Jihad, was cleared of all charges. There had been fiber transfer, but no blood. No trace of Damilola's DNA on his clothing. There simply wasn't enough to tie him to the act itself. That left the two brothers, Danny and Ricky Preddy. The murder charge was dropped, but they weren't free. The court brought them back under a new charge, manslaughter. Because even if it wasn't premeditated, even if there was doubt over whether they stabbed him or pushed him, the fact remained Damilola Taylor died at their hands. And now, the court had to decide one key thing: intent. Was there intent to harm? Was this a random scuffle that turned tragic, a targeted act of violence? Did they pick up the glass and stab Damilola with it? Or did they shove him, not knowing that there was broken glass nearby? Let me just interject here. No one believed it was an accident. Not really. Not the public, not the press, but the court had to work within the law. They had to weigh the evidence, and the evidence didn't confirm what people felt. It only confirmed what could be proven. In the end, the Preddy brothers were found guilty of manslaughter for the death of a 10-year-old boy. They were each sentenced to 8 years in prison. The sentences were met with shock and a lot of frustration, but the judge explained the boys had been just 12 and 13 years old when it happened. They were legally still children. And the court acknowledged that the weapon, the broken bottle, hadn't been something they brought with them. It had been found at the scene. The implication was that this wasn't planned. This was impulsive. A moment of rage. A poor decision. A devastating result. But not premeditated murder. And that, in the eyes of the law, made a difference. They didn't bring out a weapon intending to do this to someone. Ricky Preddy ended up serving just 5 years of his original 8-year sentence. Danny served just a little over 5. And then, just like that, the two brothers were released still in their early 20s, still with decades of life ahead of them. They had their futures they'd stolen from Damilola Taylor. Since his release, Ricky Preddy has been in and out of prison multiple times. Most of his arrests have been for breaching the conditions of his parole. For example, he had been banned from ever returning to Peckham, but he violated that order. He's also been arrested for more serious offenses: GBH, grievous bodily harm, dangerous driving, driving while disqualified, failing to stop, driving without insurance, and, at one point, he even used his car in an attempt to hit a female police officer. For that string of offenses, he was sentenced to 4 more years behind bars. Meanwhile, Richard and Gloria Taylor chose a different path. After the loss of their son, they created something that would keep his memory alive: the Damilola Taylor Trust and the Damilola Taylor Center in London. A charity not built on anger or revenge, but built with the goal of prevention. The main mission? To stop other children from meeting the same fate as their son. Richard Taylor believes that young people who commit knife crimes are, in many ways, victims themselves. Victims of broken homes, poverty, and toxic environments. Victims of a society that often fails them before they even get a chance. He doesn't excuse the crimes, but he understands the root causes. He believes that upbringing matters. That when children are born into chaos, when they're surrounded by violence, poverty, and hopelessness, it shapes them. And unless someone steps in, unless someone offers another way, they might never escape it. That's what the trust tries to do. They go into communities like the one Damilola lived in. They work with at-risk youth. They intervene early, before the streets can swallow them whole. They help these kids find a focus through sports, through career training, through mentorship. They offer something many of these children have never had before: hope. A reason to believe they can be more than what the world tells them they are. Because knife crime in London is still a major issue. So is youth violence. But Richard Taylor believes that if you change the path early enough, if you reach kids when they're still young and still open, you can change the outcome. And while the trust does its part, the government has also tried, though imperfectly, to improve life in areas like Peckham. Many of the old estates that were once known hotspots for crime and unemployment have been torn down and rebuilt. In their place, new developments have been constructed, places with more green space, more play areas, and better community infrastructure. Security has been increased. Lighting has been added to darker corners of the estate as small changes, but meaningful ones. Because a lot of crimes happen in the shadows. And sometimes, a bit of light can make all the difference. More after-school programs have been introduced. More youth outreach. And the Damilola Taylor Center plays a huge role in that. At the center, young people are given more than just a safe space. They're given a chance to build themselves vesto, discover their interests, their abilities, their potential. Whether it's through sports, career coaching, or personal development, the goal is always the same: to help them build real, lasting skills, major skills that they might use to get a job one day.